The storm line over eastern Ohio looked like a bruise on the horizon long before anyone aboard could feel it. In the control car of the Navy airship USS Shenandoah, the bridge lamps threw tight cones of light on charts and dials, while the world outside stayed black and featureless. The altimeter ticked around 3,000 feet. Rigging wires thrummed a steady note through the wood and aluminum fittings. At 4 a.m., the barometer slipped again, not by much, just enough for a man who lived with air to notice. The officer of the deck glanced up through the forward observation window toward a darkness that wasn't merely night. To the west, heat lightning pulsed inside a bank of cloud the size of a county. Commander Zachary Lansdowne stood with one hand around a stanchion, boots planted wide, listening to the ship talk the way an aviator listens to an engine. Subtle, constant, personal. They had left Lakehurst the previous afternoon on a goodwill tour meant to pull the Navy's great experiment into the public's good graces. The plan was to drift over state fairs and big towns and let America look up. Shenandoah was not a balloon. She was a ship. Duralumin rings and longitudinal girders, 20 gas cells of rare helium, engines slung in cars along the keel. She was long as a city block and then some, a gray whale with windows. The crew had polished her for this run, brass bright, lines coiled, the control car smelling of shellac and coffee. Men joked about seeing Columbus by sunrise and Detroit by afternoon. Then the air changed, and the jokes dried up. By a little after 4:30, the line squall swallowed them. Wind rose in a finger snap. The nose lifted. Crewmen in the keel gangway felt weight go light in their knees. A sudden updraft, then another, shoved the great frame as if a hand the size of the sky had palmed it. Helium made her safe from fire, but nothing immune. Lansdowne ordered ballast valved and engines for slow, trying to keep the ship's long back in trim, but the pressure came from below, vertical and hard. Instruments wavered. The rudder bit and then lost the air. Condensation ran on the inside of the observation windows like sweat. The ship shot up hundreds of feet, then more. Men trying to cross from engine cars back to the keel clamp froze when the catwalk flexed. In the control car, the navigator watched the rate of climb needle swing wide. The telegraph clanged, commands running aft to men at the elevators who could feel the frames straining through the deck. "Valve!" came the next order, and gas hissed from the cells to check the climb. It worked for a breath. Then another updraft took them, fiercer, punching the nose higher still. The keel creaked, a sound like a tree splitting in a hard winter. Someone swore softly and was told to mind his mouth. They broke the top of the line and into smooth air so brief it felt like a trick. The stars showed as if they had been hiding behind a curtain. For seconds only, the ship hung. Then the downdraft hit. Shenandoah dropped as if the world had been yanked out from under her. The sudden load reversed the stress through the long spine. Rivets talked, girders complained. In the control car, the voice that called for "all stop, hands to stations," reached the aft end of the ship a heartbeat before the keel parted. The break was not a sound, but a sensation. The hull bowed, the girders at midships failed, and the ship divided almost cleanly into sections that made their own choices about gravity and wind. The control car and the forward portion yawed and fell, the world outside the windows turning from black to a rushing gray the color of rain. Men were flung against bulkheads and out into the dark. The forward engines cut abruptly. The nose, relieved of weight but not of gas, wrenched free and shot upward like an enormous, unwilling kite. In the after section, men clawed for anything fixed and rode a piece of a ship that was no longer a ship. The forward car hit a farm in Noble County, while lanterns were still being lit in kitchens. The fall shattered wood and bodies with the impersonal certainty of heavy objects meeting Earth. Commander Lansdowne died there with several of his officers and crew. A farmer, hearing the crash, ran out in boots without socks and found ruins spread in his pasture, canvas hanging from trees, aluminum torn into curls, an engine half buried and ticking as it cooled. He shouted for his son to bring blankets and a wagon. There was nothing in the field any blanket could fix. Above, in the pre-dawn, the broken nose of Shenandoah kept climbing, lightened by the loss of structure, more balloon than ship now. A handful of men clung to its framework, faces slick with rain and oil, legs wrapped through lattice. The chief boatswain's mate shouted for everyone to hold fast. The nose drifted like a ghost across the Ohio hills, then began to descend when the last valved gas finally bled away. It came down in trees, and riggers did what riggers always do. They started to make order out of whatever they were standing on. They tied off lines and built a kind of ground out of branches and bent girders, while farmers on the ridge below stared, hats off, and wondered if they were supposed to pray or fetch tools. The after section fell farther west, gouging the earth and leaving a smear of metal and cloth across a field. Survivors there crawled out from under torn structure, calling for pals by nicknames that sounded wrong out loud. One engine car toppled onto its side, intact enough that a mechanic, almost without thinking, reached in to shut fuel cocks he had opened an hour earlier. A boy from a nearby farmhouse tugged at a jacket sleeve and whispered to his father, who could not tell him whether they were looking at a shipwreck or a factory hurled from the sky. By mid-morning, the roads filled. Farmers came first, then sheriffs, then reporters, who could read weather and noise and headed toward whatever part of Ohio was speaking the loudest. Navy officers from the nearest station rode hard in automobiles that clattered over plank bridges and spit dust. They put sailors on the cordon and tried to keep souvenir hunters from cutting strips off gas cells with pocket knives. The press wrote the word Zeppelin because it fit in a headline, and they wrote storm because it sounded better than updraft and downburst. What they could not compress was the way the wreckage lay in a trail that went on for miles. The ship's life stretched out along farm lots like a map of disintegration. In Lakehurst, flags went to half-staff. The Navy wired casualty lists to families and field offices, and to a widow who had spoken plainly about her husband's concerns before he flew. Questions came with the telegrams. Why fly into a Midwestern storm front for the sake of a tour? Why risk a helium-filled ship, a national rarity, on a schedule that answered to crowds and not to weather? Hearing rooms later filled with officers who used words like program, mission, and public value, and with families who used the names of the dead. There were arguments about the orders that launched the flight, about whether caution had been set aside because the ship had become a traveling advertisement. There were the usual promises that the next time would be smarter. Back in the fields, the next time looked like men cleaning up this one. Sailors rolled gas cell fabric and lashed it. Farmers hitched teams to pull heavy frames to the road where trucks could load them. A survivor with his head bandaged took a moment to kneel by an engine and run his hand along a cylinder jacket, the way you touch a horse you have already unsaddled for the last time. In a kitchen nearby, a woman poured coffee into cups for strangers who had just fallen out of the sky, and a medic laid out instruments on a towel the woman hoped never to see used. The inventory of loss made its way into print. A commanding officer, officers who had memorized the ship's voice, machinists who could tell you how a crankshaft felt through the soles of their shoes, riggers who carried spools of safety line as if they were wedding rings. The inventory of survival took longer to assemble because it lived in fragments and luck. A man who chose the afterwatch rather than the forward, another who happened to be in the keel when the car tore away, a pair who caught a tangle of wire at just the right second. Some of the survivors stayed with airships and proved there was a future. Others went to ground jobs where weather was a thing to look at rather than to live inside. For weeks, pieces of Shenandoah kept turning up, metal in hedgerows, a brace in a creek, a patch of gray skin in a barn where someone had hung it like a trophy, and then felt ashamed of the feeling. The Navy hauled the major sections back to Lakehurst and walked them into a hangar that seemed too clean for such grief. Engineers measured failed members and talked about gust loads and stress distribution like they were discussing tools instead of lives. In print, the official language called it a structural failure induced by violent vertical air currents. In Noble County, they called it the storm that ripped a ship apart. Ohio did what places do when they have seen something that will not happen again in just that way. They marked where the control car fell, where the nose came down, where the stern dragged a furrow. People drove out on Sundays to stand at fence lines and squint at fields that looked normal until someone pointed. Children grew up with the story as if it had happened last week. The sky over the county went back to being only sky, often gentle, sometimes mean, and the roads went back to wagons, and then cars, and then more cars. The airship program kept going for a while, as experiments do when money and hope find a way to agree. Other ships rose in other hangars. Some met their ends at sea, some in moorings, some not at all, until the country decided there were better ways to cross the air. The lessons Shenandoah left behind were recorded in reports that are still legible, about weather that climbs as well as blows, about length and strength, and what a frame can stand before it cannot stand anything more. The lessons that never make the reports are quieter, that a crew can love a machine without mistaking it for a promise, that the difference between spectacle and service is measured in decisions about when to launch and when to wait. At dawn on the anniversary years, when fog lies low in the fields of Noble County, you can imagine for a moment that the gray above the corn is not weather, but fabric, that a shape larger than anything reasonable is moving where it should not be able to move. It passes. The fields return to their own business. The families who live there now will tell you where the nose came down if you ask, and they will point with the flat of a hand, and the distance they show you will be longer than you think. Thank you for listening to The Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.